it's on foot, possibly on a donkey, although there's no scriptural proof or support or statement about that. Although I still found this cartoon kind of humorous. Do we have that? I don't know if you guys can read that. The one donkey on the far end says, "My kid is an honor roll student." And presumably Mary's donkey says, "Your kid may be an honor roll, but mine is God's son." We don't know whether she rode a donkey, but it was 130 kilometers from Nazareth down to Bethlehem. And I think if you were a serious skeptic, you might ask this question: how do we know that Mary didn't make this trip to fulfill well-established prophecy, so that she and Joseph could somehow say, well, look, our kid is the Messiah? What if this was her and Joseph's attempt to just make it look like this was a virgin birth, to make it look like Jesus was the Messiah, promised in Micah 5 verse 2 and elsewhere? What if this is some grand, elaborate conspiracy? Well, in Luke chapter 2, Luke relates that the trip to Bethlehem had nothing to do with human design. This wasn't an attempt on Joseph and Mary's part to try to fulfill prophecy. This wasn't their conspiracy. This wasn't even their choice. They only went down to Bethlehem because of a decree from Caesar Augustus. Caesar wanted to find out how many citizens he had, so he decreed that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world, which would encompass all the lands surrounding the Mediterranean Sea, as high north as England, modern-day England, as far south as southern Egypt, that entire Mediterranean region. And it would include Syria and Judea, which is where Mary and Joseph were from, and Syria, which is where another character in the passage that Alex read, Quirinius, was the governor. And Caesar didn't issue this decree presumably to appease his curiosity. It wasn't like he was saying, well, I wonder how many people I'm ruling today. Instead, Caesar wanted to know how many people he could tax. How much money is owing me? How many people are of taxable age? And we know that in Syria, anybody, male or female, age 12 and older was taxable age. And then also, he wanted to know how many men there were, so that in the event of the Roman Empire being threatened, he could conscript these men as his soldiers and force them to fight on his behalf. So it was for taxation purposes, for money, and for military purposes, to see how many men he had. So everyone had to go to their hometown to register, and Joseph was from Bethlehem. That's why he had to go to Bethlehem. And Mary, his fiancée, went with him. Now, as I think about it, could there be anything more inconvenient for Mary and Joseph than this ridiculous decree? At the best of times, it took 3 days to travel on foot from Nazareth to Bethlehem. And I don't know about you, but I'm thinking, donkey or not, you know, if Mary's in her 9th month, I'm thinking it's going to take 4 or 5 days minimum. Now, if Mary's telling Joseph that she was pregnant but still a virgin wasn't already a test on their relationship, I'm thinking that 130 kilometers on foot would also be a test on their relationship. We know that Joseph was a carpenter. That means he earned a modest wage. And so he would feel the cost of this trip. I mean, who can take an 8 to 10 day round trip for two and not have it cost something, right? There would be food, there'd be lodging, donkey rental, perhaps. This trip would have cost Joseph some money. Now, I seriously doubt that Joseph and Mary were in a position or in an era where they would contemplate even having a honeymoon like ours. I mean, can you imagine? Right? They just didn't have the means. They didn't have that luxury. People had to work all the time just to survive. But still, I think, and wouldn't be surprised if this trip down to Bethlehem absorbed all of Joseph's liquid money, the money that maybe he was saving up for the wedding, the money that maybe he was saving up for items for their future home, and so forth. I mean, talk about infuriating. You've spent months, maybe years, saving, and then some government far away makes a decree that you've got to go somewhere, and you've got to do it. You have no choice. Perhaps even more significant, the trip would cost Joseph time. One of the conversations I have with people, every job has its perks and its you know, things that we don't like so much about it. And whenever we go to conferences around here, it's always a little bit more difficult for people who are wage earners get paid per the hour versus salaried employees to make that decision. Because when you're a wage earner and you're gone, that's money that's not available to you, right? Joseph would have lost wages. And what if Mary went into labor somewhere along the way? It's not like they had a doctor on hand. So any way you look at it, Caesar's decree would have meant more than a little inconvenience for this young couple. Nevertheless, as citizens of the Roman Empire, Joseph and Mary did what they had to do. When Caesar issued a decree, it was obey or else. Now, I don't know about you, but I can kind of imagine a conversation that Joseph and Mary had before making that trip. And I see it going something like this. Joseph, you can't be serious. Are you telling me that now we have to go down to Bethlehem? I mean, look at me. Honey, I'm telling you, we've got no choice. I mean, unless you want to raise this kid alone and have me get conscripted and serving Caesar off and who knows where. I'm sorry, Joseph. I just don't get it. God, I don't get it. Can't you do something about this? Do you really want your son to be at risk, the kind of risk that he'd face on such a journey? So did God deliver Mary and Joseph from making that journey? No. Did God send them a chariot pulled by flaming horses to make the trip a little quicker and easier? No. Could he? Yeah. He did it for Elijah, but he didn't for Mary and Joseph. In fact, God permitted Caesar to issue and keep his decree. God permitted Joseph and Mary to endure this untimely, costly, difficult, stress-inducing journey that undoubtedly put the lives of both mother and unborn child at much greater risk than if they had been able to stay in Nazareth, around their family and friends and medical attention. But of course, God had a purpose in allowing things to go down this way. See, although Luke only mentions four main characters in the passage that Alex read, Quirinius, Caesar Augustus, Joseph, and Mary, the main character is God himself. In his sovereignty, God is working in unseen ways behind the scenes. As a matter of fact, God was using the decree of a Roman dictator to ensure that his son was born at the proper place in the proper time. Hundreds of years earlier, it had been prophesied that the Savior would be born in Bethlehem. And so it would be. I appreciate John Calvin's insight on this. Over 400 years ago, a passionate Christ follower and theologian named John Calvin said this, that Mary and Joseph were led by God like blind people to the place where Christ was to be born. Like blind people. How's that for an image? I guess it's okay if you're God. If you happen to be Mary and Joseph, it's a little harder, isn't it? It's a little bit more faith-stretching to be led in that way. And I believe there's a message here for you and for me. How many times haven't you wondered why you were experiencing some hardship or where your life was headed, when in fact you were on the exact road that you were meant to be on? How often haven't you wondered where God was in your life, or maybe even if he had abandoned you, when in fact not only was he with you, but he was indeed directing your pathway